Now turning our attention to what's happening in Ukraine. Moscow is facing increasing isolation as President Vladimir Putin showed no sign of stopping the invasion of Ukraine. Now the ongoing fighting and Russian bombardment have killed dozens and sparked a refugee crisis in the region. Russia's invasion launched last week has failed to achieve the decisive early gains that Putin would have hoped for. And ceasefire talks held yesterday also failed to reach a breakthrough, and the negotiators have not indicated when new discussions will be held. Associate Professor of African Politics in the Department of Political Sciences at Unisa, Professor Everisto Benyera, joins us now virtually for a more in-depth perspective on this conflict. Professor Benyera, thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Sakina, and to the viewers, and thank you for having me on the show.
So given yesterday's developments in the Ukraine and on the border with Belarus, there was, of course, hope that there would be some possibility of a ceasefire. But let's look at what's happened there and whether there is the chance of a possible ceasefire to bring about an end to this ongoing conflict at the moment.
Sakina, every war will eventually come to an end, but on whose terms will it come to an end is the cardinal question. The meeting that was held yesterday on the Belarusian border was a key moment in this conflict, in that not only did the two parties agree to meet directly, the fact that they met for over 5 hours implies that they were discussing some issues that were quite detailed. We understand that they exchanged positions and that they are going back to their principles to come back with some feedback. So here is a light at the end of the tunnel, that at least there is some positions that have been exchanged and that negotiation finally is taking place in earnest, albeit with the conflict almost in a balance, as Russia is making some military advances and Ukraine and its allies are inflicting other forms of damage to the Russian Federation, especially to the Russian economy, Sakina.
Professor Benyera, what, to your view, is actually happening here? What is at play? Because we, of course, saw Russia advancing on some of the territories as far back as 2014, and they have not really been attacked or pushed back in any sort of meaningful way. So what is really at play here right now?
We need a PhD thesis to make that analysis, Sakina. In a nutshell, this is about geopolitics and spheres of influence between two competing global powers, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization on one hand, and the Collective Security Treaty Organization on the other hand, one being led by the United States and another one by Russia, by the Russian Federation. And what caused this conflict, in my view, was the gains that were being made by the United States and NATO, not only in consolidating the now 27-member NATO, but in, most importantly, advancing to the doorsteps of the Russian Federation. You will understand that if Ukraine had successfully joined NATO, which was likely, then NATO was going to be right on the borders of the Russian Federation. Flip the coin the other way. It was almost like Russia enters into an agreement with Mexico. That gives the possibility that Russia could be directly placing its nuclear arsenal in Mexico facing the United States. This is what triggered the Russian Federation to invade. From the north, coming from Kharkiv, then from the two Donbass regions of Luhansk and Donetsk, and from the south, from the Crimea region and also the Odessa, coming to neutralize Ukraine so that NATO does not have an influence in Ukraine. In a nutshell, what I am saying is that the war in Ukraine is about who controls the political regime in Ukraine. Is it the United States and NATO, or is it Russia and the Collective Security Treaty Organization, Sakina?
So as it stands right now, Professor Benyera, who controls what happens in Ukraine?
Right now, no one controls what is happening in Ukraine. And instead of the two, one of them controlling Ukraine or Ukraine becoming neutral, my analysis is that Ukraine is going to become a sort of a hybrid a hybrid Afghanistan, if you like, because the type of weapons that are being pumped into Ukraine by its allies, the random nature in which those weapons are being handed over to whoever wants to get those military-grade equipment, the fact that Ukraine opened its borders to anyone who wants to fight, the fact that Ukraine opened its prisons and released convicted criminals to take up arms, you do not know who is fighting who, because it is an oversimplification of a very complicated situation to assume that anyone who is taking up these NATO-donated weapons is doing so in order to fight Russia. That is far from the truth. There are a lot of organizations that are going to benefit from these freebies that are being issued by NATO in Ukraine. Ukraine is going to be an ungovernable country if nothing concrete happens in the next few days.
So let's talk about the advances that Russia had already made in the Donbas region. What happens there? Are they likely to basically pull back and give that back to Ukraine wholesale? What's the role of NATO in all of this? And perhaps we need to spend a bit of time talking about NATO, the Ukraine's right to join NATO as a sovereign state, and also the view that NATO perhaps is against Russia.
Sakina, the notion of sovereignty itself is one that is highly contested, and it is being contested by a lot these days. Who is sovereign? Is it the state or the nation? Is it the people or the instrument for managing the people? In my view, sovereignty should belong to the people and not to the state. The whole problem here is exacerbated by the fact that the state usurped sovereignty from the people. Let me directly answer your question. What is the role of NATO in the Donbas regions? The Donbas regions of Luhansk and Donetsk are very important in this conflict because for the Russian Federation, it can have a buffer between itself and NATO should the eventuality happen that Ukraine joins NATO. So this is why there was so much of a causal relationship between the land between the port of Mariupol to the south and Kyiv to the north. And if you visualize the map of Ukraine, you will see that the regions that the Russian Federation is holding today and holding so decisively are those that puts a buffer between itself and Ukraine, and most importantly, between itself and NATO. And what will happen, in my estimation, is that the Russian Federation will allow these buffer states to remain independent so that at least it is shielded from a direct NATO exposition on its borders.
Well, unfortunately, we have to end this interview, but I just have to ask you about what many people have opined on being the double standards at play here, Professor. They look at what's happening in the Ukraine and they look at what's happened in other parts of the world in terms of the reaction of the United Nations through its Security Council, the General Assembly, the role of NATO as an example. And let's not forget, again, even during this conflict, our elastic morals, if you will, and bringing about to the fore, once again, just how duplicitous we can be as a world in dealing with the issue of race, even at a time like this, where, again, Arabs, Indians, Africans were pushed to the side when it came to evacuating Ukraine.
This goes to the heart of who is the human and who constituted the idea and the concept of the human. When they speak about human rights in Europe and the United States, they do not talk about people like you and me because we do not qualify in their classification of a human. This is why we were enslaved. This is why we were colonized. This is why we were experimented upon, because in their view, they are not committing any human rights abuses because we are not humans. Stated in a different way, this is why Europe is so shocked, because this has happened to people who look like them. There was a correspondent on Al Jazeera who said, these are blue-eyed people with blonde hair that are being bombed. For God's sake, this is not Iraq, Afghanistan, or any other uncivilized place in Africa. So there is the answer. The double standards at the United Nations Security Council, at the World Bank, at the World Trade Organization, anywhere, at any multilateral organization is not by default, but it is by design. By extension, this is why the International Criminal Court has always placed emphasis on African despots, has always placed emphasis on crimes committed in Africa by Africans, not crimes committed in Africa by non-Africans, especially whites that are from Euro-North Africa. Me and you, Sakina, are not humans. We can be bombed, we can be isolated, we can be told to stay in Ukraine and face the Russian bombs, because in the views of those that hold power, the human has got a template. This is why there is a new concept called the epidermal passport. If you are black, you don't cross from Ukraine to safety in Poland. You must stay. If you are white, no questions are asked, Sakina.
Professor, we have to leave it there for today. Hopefully we'll speak again at a later stage. Dr. Everisto Benyera giving us his views on the Russia-Ukraine war. Thanks so much for your time. It's time to take a quick break, and Leanne is still out in Sandton at